Right, we now come to the urgent question. Leila Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Minister if he will make a statement on the situation in Israel and Gaza.
I'll need some words. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the whole House will be gravely concerned about the desperate situation in Gaza. It cannot continue, and we are deploying all our diplomatic resources, including in the United Nations, to help find a viable solution. I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for her urgent question and also for the private messages from Gaza that she has made available to me. And I'm looking forward to meeting her in the Foreign Office tomorrow. The scale of civilian deaths and displacement in Gaza is shocking. I was particularly disturbed to hear about the situation of civilians trapped in the Holy Family Church complex in Gaza City, the lack of water and food, and reports of sniper fire causing civilian deaths inside the complex. Although Israel has the right to defend itself against terror, restore its security and bring the hostages home, it must abide by international law and take all possible measures to protect civilians. Mr. Speaker, no one wants to see this conflict go on for a moment longer than necessary. We recognise the sheer scale of the suffering and are appalled at the impacts on civilians. What we urgently need are more humanitarian pauses to get all the hostages out and life-saving aid in. We welcome the recent opening of Kerem Shalom crossing to help achieve this, but it is not enough. Our immediate priorities are to secure the release of British hostages, to show solidarity with Israel in defending itself against Hamas, whilst complying with international humanitarian law, and to call for such pauses, both at the UN and directly with Israel, to ensure emergency aid can be distributed in Gaza, including fuel, water and medicine. The Foreign Secretary will discuss the situation in Gaza with regional leaders this week in his visit to Egypt and Jordan. The government has recently announced an additional £30 million of British aid, tripling the UK aid budget for the occupied Palestinian territories this financial year. To date, Mr. Speaker, we have delivered 74 tonnes of aid, but there is still more to do. Casualty numbers are far too high, and we are calling on Hamas to release each and every kidnapped hostage. We are also actively exploring other routes for aid into Gaza, including maritime options. Of course, Mr. Speaker, as both the Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary have said, ultimately this must end. We of course want to see an end to the fighting, but this must be a sustainable ceasefire, meaning Hamas must stop launching rockets into Israel and release the hostages. Over 130 hostages are still unaccounted for. They must be released immediately and returned to their families. To achieve long-term peace in the Middle East, a viable two-state solution is needed. Leaving Hamas in power in Gaza would be a permanent roadblock on the path to this. No one can be expected to live alongside a terrorist organisation, committed to its destruction and dedicated to repeating those attacks.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm extremely grateful to you for granting this urgent question. I thank the Minister for his response. I'll begin by pointing to my register of interests as an unpaid advisor to ICJP. I've spoken before in this House about my extended family who are in the Holy Family Parish Church in Zaytun in Gaza. And the situation has been desperate for weeks, but now it's descending. There are tanks outside the gates, there are soldiers and snipers pointing into the complex, shooting at anyone who ventures out. And the convent was bombed. On Saturday, 2 women were shot. They were simply trying to get to the toilet. There is no electricity, there is no clean water, and the update that I had last night was that they're down to their last can of corn. I'm told, after pressure, that food has been delivered, but they've not seen it. And when this began a week ago, the IDF soldiers ordered these civilians to evacuate against their will. Can the government confirm that it sees the forcible displacement of civilians as unacceptable? Yeah. The people in this church, Mr. Speaker, are civilians. They have nothing to do with Hamas. They are nuns, orphans, disabled people. They are a small Christian community, and they know everyone. As the Pope has said, and my family can confirm, it is categorically untrue to say Hamas are operating from there. This situation has been condemned by many. Will this government do so? But it is important to stress this suffering is not confined to just this church. And just last week, we saw the utterly tragic deaths of 3 Israeli hostages. There are others reportedly murdered by Hamas and hundreds still in captivity. This is also unacceptable. And 73 days on in this conflict, the death toll is only rising. It is time for the international community to say this violence is now making peace harder, not easier. The government talks now of a sustainable ceasefire. And while I and the Liberal Democrats welcome the change in tone, it is unclear whether this is in fact a change in position. Will the government demand an immediate bilateral ceasefire? Will it change how it votes at the UN Security Council as a result? And when will the Prime Minister accept that the only route to peace is political, not military? That there is one way to get rid of Hamas and to end the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, and it's not this. And very finally, when will the United Kingdom fulfil its historic obligations to the region, recognise Palestine as a first step to delivering the two states, which is the only way to guarantee security and dignity for both Israelis and Palestinians?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the Honourable Lady for her comments. I understand how deeply distressing this is for her, with her family caught up in the Holy Family Church complex. As I said in my response, I'm grateful to her for the harrowing update she was able to give me direct from the Holy Family Church. I'm very pleased to hear that she thinks food has been delivered, and we will follow up that point directly after this urgent question. She talks about the protection of civilians, and the British government makes absolutely clear that international humanitarian law must be abided by. She asked about, when she mentioned humanitarian aid, I can tell the House that yesterday we understand that 191 trucks entered Gaza Strip, 127 through Rafah and 64 through Kerem Shalom, which is a new avenue which we very much welcome. Finally, the point she made about the United Nations resolution. We are working with partners on a resolution, and I expect that there will be a vote at 3 p.m. UK time today. That is what we are working towards. And while the position is not yet clear, we are hoping to support that resolution.
Tobias Selwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While walking to Parliament yesterday, I politely challenged a driver who had selfishly parked his car in the bus lane leading onto Chelsea Bridge so he could buy a coffee at the nearby kiosk. When I suggested he move it, given the traffic chaos it was causing, he blankly refused, began swearing at me, threatened to throw my phone in the river if I took a photo of him, and then he called me a racist and a Zionist. Sadly, this illustrates how hate and intolerance here in the UK is being fuelled by events in the Middle East. So I ask the Minister, this conflict is now in its third month with no end in sight, no clarity from Israel as to how long the occupation will last, and the death toll is mounting. Would the Minister agree that without concerted international intervention, this conflict will escalate?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend, I'm appalled to hear about the way he was treated on his way into the House of Commons today. We are stressing, Mr. Speaker, the importance of a more surgical approach by the Israeli Defence Forces. We are working towards a more sustainable cessation of hostilities. We recognise that there are too many casualties, and we are pressing forward on the policy of both the government and the opposition of more extensive humanitarian pauses so that aid can be got into Gaza.
Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for Oxford West and Abingdon for securing this very important urgent question. And may I say how deeply sorry I am to hear of the terrifying experience facing her family in Gaza. I'm sure the whole House are with her and her relatives at what must be an incredibly difficult time. The reports from the Holy Family Catholic Church are shocking. An innocent mother and daughter killed in the grounds of a church, others too scared to leave and now running out of food. Once again in this conflict, a place of sanctuary and peace has become a scene of fear and death. It is one example of the ongoing humanitarian catastrophe confronting civilians across Gaza, and a reminder of the urgent imperative to address this crisis and help to bring about the conditions for a sustainable ceasefire. It comes at a moment of growing concern that this conflict could escalate, with Hezbollah in the north, with more violence in the West Bank, and with Houthi threats in the Red Sea. We support efforts to maintain regional security, and Labour welcomes the UK's participation in the new maritime security effort, and we thank our armed forces personnel for their service and professionalism. Today, the United Nations Security Council is voting once again on a resolution. This is a crucial chance to address the urgent and catastrophic situation in Gaza. Let me be clear. Labour wants a resolution to pass. A resolution that can protect civilian lives. A resolution that demands hostages are released. A resolution that can act as a stepping stone towards a sustainable ceasefire and provide renewed impetus towards a two-state solution. The time has come for the United Kingdom to support our international allies at this critical moment.
Minister.
Well, I thank the Shadow Foreign Secretary for his comments. In terms of the escalation, we are, as he knows, very committed to trying to make sure that there is no escalation. I thank him for his welcome for the US-led work that is going on to secure maritime security, and I also thank him for the comments, particularly at this time of year, about our armed forces. I've already commented on the UN Security Council resolution, which I hope will be voted on this afternoon, and like him, I hope that agreement can be reached. On the issue of the humanitarian catastrophe to which he referred, I can tell him that there is some movement this week. There are 50 World Food Programme trucks ready at Allenby Bridge to travel through Israel to Kerem Shalom, and if signed off, that will provide a new route through to Gaza, and we have made available some money to the World Food Programme, which is available today to enhance that route if it opens.
Robert Jenrick.
Mr. Speaker, all of us abhor the loss of innocent civilian life in Israel and Gaza. But, Mr. Speaker, talk of a sustainable ceasefire is unhelpful. All it does is give succour to Israel's enemies at the time of its greatest need. This is a country that fell to its knees just a few weeks ago and suffered the worst tragedy since the Holocaust. Now they are trying to eliminate Hamas. They are trying to free the hostages, some of whom are British citizens. Let them finish the job. Let them protect Israeli security. And in doing so, Mr. Speaker, let Israel protect our security as well.
Well, Mr. Speaker, while it is true that weapons have been discovered in incubators in a hospital in Gaza, nevertheless, I do not agree with my right honourable friend. We are working towards a sustainable ceasefire. We are not there yet. We should all of us be working towards that. And in the meanwhile, on the pathway to a sustainable ceasefire, we need urgently to get these humanitarian pauses so that humanitarian relief can enter Gaza.
SNP spokesperson Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I too send my very best wishes to the family of the Honourable Member from Oxford West and Abington. As we know, later today, the Government's call for a sustainable ceasefire will be tested at the UN Security Council. If they again decide to abdicate their responsibility to humanity and abstain, they'll be giving Netanyahu the political cover he needs to prosecute a war in which tens of thousands have already been killed, and which at the weekend, according to the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, a sniper of the IDF murdered 2 women inside the Holy Family parish in Gaza. So if the UK is unable to support a ceasefire now, when will it? What has to happen before this government says enough is enough and that the indiscriminate killing of innocents has to stop now? That the blanket bombing of civilian infrastructure has to stop now, and the killing of journalists has to stop now? And how many more breaches of international humanitarian law will it take for this government to find the moral courage and say that this has to stop and it has to stop now?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't think it's an issue of moral courage. The government, with the support of the opposition front bench, is doing what it believes to be right. We have been very clear that Israel has a right to defend itself, but it must do more to diminish and minimise the number of civilian casualties. And in respect of the point that he made about the United Nations resolution, which we hope will be passed this afternoon, as I have said, skilled British diplomats in New York are engaged with talking throughout the United Nations to try and make sure that that resolution lands in the way that both he and I want.
Mr.
Speaker, I welcome the calls from the Foreign Secretary for a sustainable ceasefire, and I welcome the words from the right honourable gentleman from the dispatch box today. Over the weekend, the Foreign Secretary received 2 letters, one from 10 backbenchers on this side of the House and another from a group of foreign policy experts calling for a permanent ceasefire. The last truce resulted in over 80 hostages being released and hundreds of lives being saved. Does he accept a permanent ceasefire would reap similar results?
Well, it is true, Mr. Speaker, that the Foreign Secretary did receive a letter over the weekend signed by 10 colleagues, and in that letter it said, and I quote, "It is widely accepted across the world that lasting security for Israel, peace for the Palestinians, an end to the killing and the defeat of Hamas can only be achieved through politics and diplomacy and the establishment of 2 states." And that is very much the view of the government as well.
Andrew Bridget.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister has clearly seen the communique from the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem pointing out the atrocities committed in the Holy Family Church grounds. 2 murdered, at least 7 wounded. Mr. Speaker, this shows a shocking lack of fire control discipline by the Israeli forces. Will the Minister raise the concerns of mine, my grave concerns, and many colleagues across the House, that this is not acceptable with the Israeli forces?
Well, Mr. Speaker, there is no need for me to raise it with the Israeli forces because they are themselves conducting an inquiry into this matter.
Tom Randall.
Speaker, at Gaza's Kamal Adwan hospital last weekend, approximately 80 Hamas fighters were arrested, some of whom took part in the 7th of October massacres. Weaponry, Hamas intelligence and military and technological equipment was recovered. Reports suggest that hospital staff directed the Israeli Defence Forces to weapons Hamas installed inside incubators for premature babies. Would my right honourable friend join me in condemning Hamas for these appalling war crimes, and would he agree that this incident underlines the disregard for human life, civilian human life in Gaza that Hamas has?
Minister.
Well, my honourable friend is quite right to point to those reports, and as I mentioned earlier, there have been reports of weapons found in incubators, in particular in Kamal Adwan hospital, and I'm sure that every member of this House condemns without qualification the appalling events perpetrated by Hamas starting on October the 7th.
Does he agree with Cardinal Vincent Nichols' version of events that took place in the compound of the Holy Family?
The honourable lady will understand I'm not in a position to make that judgment, but I have heard with great respect what the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster has said.
Robert Lee.
Well, all of us were deeply sympathetic to the plight of our Jewish brothers of the October pogrom, and most have accepted the arguments that an immediate ceasefire would have displayed into the hands of Hamas. But I think on these benches the mood is changing. Frankly, what Israel is doing is totally unacceptable. This is indiscriminate bombing of vast civilian populations, and leaving aside the outrage in the Holy Family Church. It is simply not in the interest of Israel long term that they radicalise whole generations of Arab youth. And it's not in our interest either to be involved in any way on the side of Israel doing this. So we've got to ante up the rhetoric and condemn this unequivocally.
Well, my right honourable friend will have seen the article co-authored by the Foreign Secretary and his German counterpart. He is absolutely right to refer to the pogrom that was instigated in October, and also to the importance of a sustainable ceasefire and respect for international humanitarian law. And the answer, in my view, Mr. Speaker, to his final point is that the sooner there is a political track advance. The moment that there is an opportunity to do so, it must be seized by the region, and Britain will do everything it can to support that.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think we should all thank the member for Oxford West and Abingdon for her steadfastness and for gaining this urgent question today. 18,000 people have now died across the Gaza Strip. Israel is using food and water and medicine as a weapon of war against a civilian population. There are 8,000 missing people under the rubble. As she said, this is a political solution that's required, not a military one. Can the Foreign Secretary's the Minister assure us that the vote today will bring about a ceasefire, but it will also stop the escalation of the war into the Red Sea and into the Mediterranean and start to address the underlying issue, which is, of course, Israel's occupation of the West Bank, the refugees all around the world, and of course the continued siege of Gaza, which has gone on for decades. There has to be a start of a long-term process that brings about real justice for the Palestinian people, or we're going to be back here again with more war crimes, more death, more destruction, and the horrors for decades to come.
Well, the Right Honourable Gentleman is entirely right to focus on the United Nations Security Council resolution, which we hope will be passed this afternoon, because that is the way you move the situation forward towards the political track which both he and I want to see as rapidly as possible.
Christian Wakeford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all welcome the humanitarian pause that saw the release of a number of hostages and aid delivered into Gaza. On the 1st of December, the 7-day pause collapsed following firing of rockets into Israel from Gaza. Hamas also failed to provide a daily list of hostages to be released by 7 a.m. in further violation of the truce. I ask the Minister whether he will join me in criticising Hamas for violating the truce agreement and once again proving that they are no partners for a lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians.
Well, the House will note what he has said. I can assure him that we are doing everything we can to get humanitarian support into Gaza, including focusing specifically on any maritime opportunities. And I can tell him that the Royal Fleet Auxiliary Lyme Bay is loaded with supplies in Cyprus and is ready to sail once we are able to be assured that the support can be received and delivered.
Well, Logan.
Almost 20,000 deaths in Gaza. My constituents in Bolton are asking, when is enough enough? 153 countries voting for a ceasefire. When is a sustainable ceasefire, a ceasefire that happens now? And also, from my mosque, Nur Islam Mosque in Bolton, recently visited Egypt and tried to get aid across the border into Gaza. Could the Minister meet with me to discuss ways in which we can work with the Egyptian government and other partners to make sure that aid can get from Bolton into Gaza?
So I want to thank my honourable friend both for what he has said today, but also for the information and work which he is making available from his community in Bolton into the Foreign Office. And of course I shall be very pleased to see him at a mutually convenient time.
Zora
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week I attended a briefing with Professor Ghassan Abu Sitta, a heroic British-Palestinian doctor who had just returned from Gaza. Because the Israeli siege prevents medical supplies from entering Gaza, he told us how he had to use vinegar and washing up liquids to sterilise wounds, even on the night when he performed amputations on 6 children. He recounted their screams and the desperation of their parents. I want to pay tribute to Professor Ghassan, but it will forever shame this House that the dying and the wounded that he treated were bombed and maimed by Israel with the approval of this place. So will the government finally listen to the growing global calls and demand an immediate ceasefire?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady's eloquent intervention underlines the importance of achieving a sustainable ceasefire in the way set out by the Foreign Secretary in his article at the weekend.
Sir Michael Ellis.
Over the weekend, the Israelis uncovered the largest ever Hamas tunnel, 2.5 miles long. The brother of Hamas's leader has been seen driving through this tunnel as he hides beneath Gaza's civilian population. The Minister's already spoken about 70 Hamas fighters surrendering at a hospital where, in incubators for premature babies, there were firearms. Does my right honourable friend agree that these are the important reminders of Hamas's appalling use of human shields, why Hamas must no longer brutalise Gaza's population and terrorise Israelis, and why the UK would be completely wrong to call for a ceasefire before the threat of Hamas is removed.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for his comment. I suspect that on both sides of the House there is no need for a reminder of the horrific events that Hamas perpetrated on October the 7th and since. And as he will understand, we are trying to ensure that the hostages are released as swiftly as possible, the rockets stop, and we are able to move to a political process as soon as feasible.
Calm.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hundreds of British Palestinians have seen multiple generations of their relatives killed, their family homes destroyed, and the futures in Gaza decimated. I want to put on record my thanks to the honourable friend from Oxford West and Bradford East for organising this moving event with the Professor Ghassan Abu Sita, where it was a packed room and not a single eye was dry listening to the horrific situation that is in the hospitals. Can the Minister tell me if either the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, or he himself have met any British Palestinian families, including those who have recently returned from Gaza, to witness how they have been affected by Israel's indiscriminate strikes?
Mr. Speaker, my understanding is that both the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister have had access to that information. And he makes a plea for those difficulties to end. And I hope that he will accept that the government is doing everything it can to fulfil what he wants to see and what we want to see.
Drew Percy.
There's nothing morally courageous to argue for the people who committed the atrocities on October the 7th, the rapists and the murderers who crossed into Israel on that day, to remain in power, which is what those who are demanding a ceasefire with Hamas are asking for. That is the reality of it. I feel sometimes listening in here, there are some people who hope Israel do not succeed in achieving their aims of wiping out this horrendous terrorist cult. So can I say to my right honourable friend, the Minister, whilst there may be a letter that barely reached double figures from some colleagues, very many of us on this side have been very proud of the strong stand, the moral clarity this government has had in supporting Israel after what happened on October the 7th, and I hope that continues.
Well, my honourable friend makes a very good point, and we are determined that we will end up with a situation where the Palestinians can run their own territory, where the Arab states are heavily involved. An initiative, political initiative, is regionally led. There's lots of international work, support and help that is required. But we have to get to the point where we are able to see that political track take shape.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ahead of today's UN Security Council vote, a group of foreign policy and military experts, including the former Chief of the UK Armed Forces, General Richards, have called for our Foreign Secretary to support an immediate ceasefire at the UN Security Council. And many have long argued for this, but it can only be achieved at the UN Security Council if the US stops vetoing resolutions. I welcome what the Minister has said about hoping that the UK will support such a resolution, but can he say more about what our government is doing in the next 2 hours to convince the US, at the minimum, to abstain from the resolution, to allow it through, or to support it?
Mr. Speaker, she will know that Britain, in the drafting and execution of these resolutions, always takes a leading role, and I can tell her that skilled British diplomats are using this time to try and secure agreement on the Security Council resolution, which I hope may be passed tonight. I can give her no guarantee of that, but I can give her a guarantee that British diplomats are working flat out to achieve it.
Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the honourable member for Oxford West and Abingdon for her very important statement today, and I hope food will be taken to the Holy Family Church very shortly. And I thank the Minister too for his comments. UNRWA are looking after 1.4 million people in their camps. That's more than half the population in Gaza. On my visit to Palestine in May, we heard that UNRWA was struggling to find funding. Can we make sure that UNRWA is receiving the money and aid that it needs to provide humanitarian assistance to the Palestinians now and in the future?
Mr. Speaker, we are very clear that UNRWA is playing a critical role in Gaza. We are very careful to ensure that the British taxpayers' money we spend to support UNRWA is spent in the right way. We have significantly increased our support to UNRWA, and the Americans have re-engaged in supporting UNRWA.
Okay.
Thank you. Speaker, with the latest release of the Hamas video of the 3 elderly male civilian hostages, does the Minister agree that with all the distress being experienced about events in Gaza, it's important that these innocent hostages don't become the forgotten element of the conflict? And will the government continue to do all that it can to make sure their safe release is part of any negotiations designed to bring an end to the violence?
Mr. Speaker, I can give him those assurances, and he will understand why it's unhelpful across the floor of the House to discuss the details of the negotiations in respect to the hostages. But he may rest assured that we are acting in precisely the way he has set out.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are indeed horrific accounts of sexual violence perpetrated against hostages in this conflict, including gang rape of women and genital mutilation. So will government stand firmly with the survivors of sexual violence, which should never be used as a tool of conflict, and do all possible to strengthen their access to justice?
I thank my honourable friend for her comments. She will know that this government has made a particular and important intervention to try and stop gender-based violence, and in particular the use of sexual crimes in warfare. And I can tell her that her view is well heard and well respected, and we will continue to do just that.
Drew Andrew.
Speaker, can the Minister assure this House that should there be a vote on a ceasefire brought forward today at the UN Security Council, that this government will not abdicate its responsibility to innocent children, women and men, and will vote for that ceasefire and not abstain?
Reassure the honourable gentleman that the government certainly will not abdicate its responsibility, but the way in which the government exercises its vote on the Security Council will depend upon the text that is agreed.
The entire Bibas family, including 11-month-old Kafir Bibas, were kidnapped on the 7th of October. Will the Minister agree that preconditions for a ceasefire must include both the military defeat of Hamas and the return of all the hostages?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The challenge in securing a sustainable ceasefire, for many of us have been calling for a ceasefire for some time, is not just the immediate military concerns, but also the allegations of war crimes. Just in the past week alone, the Minister will have seen the Houthi forces attacking shipping in the Red Sea. He has seen the situation outlined so powerfully by our colleague from Oxford West in the Holy Family Church. On the 11th of December, he told this House, when I asked him about this, that the government was continuing to identify and look for mechanisms for ensuring that there can be no impunity to anybody who commits a war crime. Can he now update us as to whether he has identified such a mechanism and what that might be?
Well, the words that I used were absolutely precise. The government has no tolerance of impunity from those who commit war crimes. And there are legal mechanisms and other mechanisms which are available and which we see every day in our papers. And of course, the government supports those processes to ensure that there is not impunity for war crimes.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 129 hostages are still in captivity at the hands of the terrorist group Hamas. Still, despite diplomatic efforts, the International Red Cross has not been given access to them. All we see is videos coming out. At the same time, the Hamas leadership is meeting in Turkey with other terrorist groups, planning what they will do next. Irrespective of what the United Nations says, calling for a ceasefire just enables Hamas to regroup and set about their evil doings once again.
My honourable friend makes a very good point, and that is why it is the policy both of the government and, as I understand it, the opposition front bench, not to call for an immediate ceasefire. Hamas have made it absolutely clear that they will not respect or accept a ceasefire. Indeed, they want to repeat what happened on October the 7th, and Israel has an absolute right of self-defence to go after the people who perpetrated those terrible events on October the 7th.
Richard Bergen.
Speaker, Human Rights Watch has warned that the Israeli government is using starvation of civilians as a method of warfare in Gaza. Let's be clear, this is a war crime. Amnesty has similarly warned of war crimes, as has the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. So surely the government should not be standing by while Israel commits war crimes, but should be calling for an immediate ceasefire that could swiftly help prevent further such crimes. And doesn't a failure to do so risk complicity in those war crimes?
The government has heard the words of President Herzog that Israel will respect international humanitarian law, and the government expects Israel to abide by the words of the President.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My humble friend for Harrow East referenced a meeting of Hamas officials, including its deputy chairman and former leader in Turkey recently, where Hamas set out their intent to carry on their brutal acts further to the October the 7th massacre. What assessment has my right honourable friend made of Turkey's role in facilitating Hamas's continuing war crimes, and how will he pursue accountability for supposed NATO allies and strategic partners?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the government makes clear to all countries where it stands on this. We do not think that a ceasefire at this time is possible or practical. We are seeking humanitarian pauses as long as possible to get aid in, and we are in favour, when it is conceivably possible, of a sustainable ceasefire, and we hope that time will come as soon as possible.
Sammy Wilson.
Isn't the real reason why there are so many civilian casualties in Gaza is that Hamas have cruelly and deliberately and willfully used the civilian population as cover, whether it's operating from hospitals, firing from schools, storing weapons in people's houses, or hiding in the civilian population. And is not the reason why we must not allow this terrorist group to continue to have a base to try and eliminate Israel, and why a ceasefire at present would stop the Israeli military fulfilling their obligation to protect their people in the long run by eliminating Hamas?
Well, the honourable gentleman makes a very good point. While the Israeli Defence Force and Israel use their military forces to defend their civilian population, it is Hamas who use their civilian population to defend Hamas.
Andrew Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week's comments from the Israeli ambassador effectively ruling out a two-state solution serve as further evidence of the difference that exists between our aspirations for the region and those of both the Israeli government and, of course, Hamas. Given the chasm that exists between those conflicting objectives, is it now not time to urgently press for a permanent ceasefire to enable the diplomatic measures necessary to bring about consensus on a lasting peace?
Well, in respect of the comments by the ambassador to the UK from Israel, he will have seen the response of the British government to that, and in particular the response of the Foreign Secretary. And for the second part of his question in respect of a permanent ceasefire, he will have heard not only what the government has said, but also what the opposition front bench has said.
Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the United Kingdom government urge the government of Israel to ratify the Rome Statute and thus to become a state party to the International Criminal Court?
Yeah. The Right Honourable Gentleman will know that Britain is a signatory to the International Criminal Court because we think that it is a vital piece of the international architecture, but it is for all countries to make their own decisions in that respect, and he will know that a number of countries, including America, have so far declined to join.
Gabriel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Shot and killed for going to the toilet. The Honourable Member for Oxford West and Abington has described just one example of what Palestinians in Gaza are going through.
and our heart goes out to her and her family, but also to all those in Gaza who are affected, all those civilians in Gaza who are affected by these appalling treatment at the moment. So many Israeli leaders, Mr. Speaker, have openly pushed for the expulsion of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip and called for the second Nakba in Gaza. Will the Minister reassure this House that the British government opposes any such attempt to forcibly expel and displace Palestinians from Gaza?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Dr. Rupert.
Speaker, with such death, devastation and destruction that we've all seen unfold in real time, constituents are asking, are there any British fingerprints or funding to be found behind the bullets and bombs used in the horror show of Gaza and the West Bank? And he talks of a two-state solution, but as was pointed out, the Netanyahu regime and their ambassadors to the UK have rejected this. So how can we allow present tactics to go on unabated when there's no clear picture how this and when this will end?
The Honourable Lady's point underlines the vital importance of moving to a political track as soon as it is possible to do so.
Thank you. Britain must maintain that international law is followed on the international stage, specifically the protection of civilians, including innocent children. Does he agree that although the humanitarian pause was an important step, testing the negotiation and mediation of intermediaries, and of course the release of hostages, that in the end only a lasting ceasefire will bring around the conditions for peace? And does he also agree, and we've heard it here in the chamber today, that the Israeli government do have to accept that for them to have stationhood and live in peace, they must also want the same for their neighbour too?
Well, that is why the government is working towards a sustainable ceasefire, but in the meanwhile we are anxious to secure the necessary pauses so that aid can be got into Gaza as speedily as possible.
Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Honourable Lady, the member for Oxford West, for securing this urgent question, and for you, sir, for granting it. My heart goes out to her family and indeed everybody else caught up in this dreadful conflict. I welcome the words of the Foreign Secretary calling for a sustainable ceasefire that must see all the hostages released and fighting on both sides end. We need to get that aid in. But can he say some more about how we permanently end this cycle of violence? How do we get that two-state solution?
Well, I thank him for his comments. He is right that we are not calling for a ceasefire hoping that somehow it becomes more permanent. What we are doing is calling for a sustainable ceasefire that allows you to move towards the political track, which will then deliver what the Honourable Gentleman is calling for.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Honourable Member for Oxford West and Aberdeen. As we all get ready to celebrate Christmas with our families, she'll be thinking desperately about her family, and I think about all the families who are not going to be together this Christmas. Pauses are not enough to allow the rehabilitation of vital infrastructure. Due to repeated shutdowns of communication and internet services, Gaza is now in danger of becoming an information vacuum. Transparency is absolutely essential in order to hold military forces to account and prevent further humanitarian atrocities. So will the Minister please update the House on how the UK is working to ensure that power and communication and that infrastructure is restructured so that we can get help and clarity on those in desperate need?
Well, we are working to get to that point, Mr. Speaker, but we are not at it at the moment. And we need to do everything we can to reconnect vital infrastructure that has been destroyed. And it's not just people suffering from the effects of kinetic activity. It's also the effect of a lack of food and the disease that is growing. So she may rest assured that everything we can do in respect of the infrastructure to which she refers, we will do when we get the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to welcome the incremental move in the Foreign Secretary's joint statement at the weekend, but given the desperate events in Gaza and the position of the vast majority of the rest of the world, these are just weasel words. The government and Labour front bench were rightly rightly quick to condemn the heinous war crimes committed against civilians in Ukraine and by Hamas on October the 7th. And the Minister has repeatedly said that Israel needs to abide by international law, but he knows that Israel is not doing so. So can I ask him, is the cold-blooded killing of two civilian women seeking sanctuary in a church a war crime? Yes or no?
Well, in order to give an answer to his question, I need to know the full facts, and I hope very much that the full facts will become available before too long.
Slaughter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The agenda of the Netanyahu government is to save him from jail, wreak revenge on all Gazans for the crimes of Hamas, and to recreate the Nakba in the occupied territories. The UK government's refusal to call for a ceasefire now gives cover to this. How many tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians must be killed, and how many millions made refugees, starved or terrorised before this government calls for it to stop, and to stop now?
I don't agree with the honourable gentleman that that is the government's position. We are not providing cover for anything. We are insistent that international humanitarian law should be accepted and respected, and we will do everything we can to get to a position of a sustainable ceasefire. But as he will accept, we are not there yet, and in the meanwhile it's important to press for opportunities to get humanitarian aid and support into Gaza to help people who are in a terrible position.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza is grave, with women and children sadly comprising the majority of civilian casualties. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu must understand that he cannot attain lasting peace and security by razing Gaza to the ground, which must be condemned. We don't just need an immediate cessation of fighting or a temporary week-long ceasefire like that we had recently, but we need negotiations to enable an enduring ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire. So, Minister, what is the UK government doing to work with our international allies to enable just that?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the negotiations and discussions with Prime Minister Netanyahu are widespread. He will know that there have been regular discussions between our Prime Minister and Prime Minister Netanyahu, and also the Foreign Secretary has been part of those discussions as well, and indeed I think Sir Tony Blair is seeing Prime Minister Netanyahu shortly too. So he can rest assured that the urgency of the situation is being well ventilated by senior British politicians.
Andy MacDonald.
Last week I too had the honour of meeting the heroic Professor Abu Sitta along with the Honourable Member for Oxford West and Aberdeen and other colleagues from across the House. He told us of the most harrowing account of his experience working as a surgeon, having to perform amputations on children without proper painkillers and using only vinegar and washing up liquid to sterilise wounds due to Israel's blockade on medical supplies. The doctor also spoke of the war crimes being committed, with the Israeli army dropping white phosphorus, burning deep into the muscle and tissue of children, and snipers killing Palestinian doctors as they cared for the injured and dying. So I asked the Minister, will he meet with the Professor to hear for himself about the unspeakable pain and suffering being meted out to innocent people, and explain to him why this government still refuses to condemn these heinous contraventions of international humanitarian law? Will he meet him?
I will certainly, either I or another Minister in the Foreign Office will certainly be pleased to meet him. The harrowing evidence to which he referred merely underlines the critical importance of moving towards a sustainable ceasefire and in the immediate future securing the humanitarian pauses we are all seeking.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While the government should be leading the call for an immediate, complete and permanent ceasefire, what assurances has he, the Foreign Secretary or indeed the Prime Minister had that actors in this conflict will abide by today's UN Security Council resolution, should it pass?
Well, Mr. Speaker, she is asking me to prophesy about the future. Let us see if we can secure a United Nations Security Council resolution, and then we can move to trying to ensure that everyone honours it.
Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The shooting of Yotam Haim, Alon Shimraz, Sema Talalka, the 3 Israeli hostages carrying a white flag, as well as the attack on the church, the Catholic Church, I believe belie the claim of the IDF that their actions are precise and intelligence-led. There is now strong evidence, I believe, of war crimes. I accept what the Minister is saying about calling for a ceasefire, and I hope that we get an immediate ceasefire ahead of Christmas. But can he help me in the case of 2 families I have, Ala Al-Safi, who's lost 50 members of her family, and Enas Al-Alul, about how they, who have nothing to do with Hamas, should be able to get out of Gaza?
Well, he makes an important intervention about the humanitarian effects of what is going on in Gaza. But as I have repeatedly said, Mr. Speaker, that underlines the importance that the government is working day and night to try and deliver these pauses and then a sustainable ceasefire.
Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I press upon the Minister the strength and support of my constituents about the need for an immediate ceasefire, not only because of the starvation we are beginning to see and the children being treated with washing up with liquid and vinegar, but also because 93 health workers have been reportedly detained with no information of their whereabouts or well-being. So I wonder if the Minister could give his assessment the government has made of the International Committee for the Red Cross's ability to access health workers who are detained by Israeli forces.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the position is unclear, but the focus of the government is very clear. It is to deliver the humanitarian pauses which we require in order to secure the necessary humanitarian support inside Gaza.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Jabalia Refugee Camp, Shifa Hospital, Amari Mosque, the Holy Family Church. These are all civilian targets, Mr. Speaker, which have been obliterated by Israeli bombing or attacked by IDF snipers. There are near 18,000 dead, nearly 1.5 million displaced. UN experts themselves have now warned that we're at risk of witnessing a genocide in the making in Gaza. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to know, will the Minister now use all diplomatic measures, including sanctions, to compel Israel and Hamas to end alleged breaches of international law, whilst at last also demanding a permanent, immediate ceasefire alongside the release of those hostages?
He will have heard what I've said about the plausibility of an immediate and permanent ceasefire. The point that he makes about the civilians who are in such extreme jeopardy, he will be aware that Hamas quite deliberately uses civilians in order to defend itself and for military purposes. And that makes the situation all the more difficult to reach the progress that we all want to see.
Jeff Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope the government are able to support a UN resolution today, but we desperately need an immediate ceasefire to protect the civilian population in Gaza and to create the space for dialogue for a permanent ceasefire. And once we get to that permanent ceasefire, I wonder how he sees the UK role in ensuring, in getting to the political solution on the ground, and particularly in ensuring that the Palestinian population is not permanently displaced.
Well, I share with him a view that the United Nations Security Council resolution is urgently needed, and I very much hope it will be in a form that we can support shortly at the UN. In terms of the ceasefire, he will have heard what has been said both by the government and by the opposition front bench about the plausibility of achieving that. And in terms of the role that Britain will play once the sky clears and there's an opportunity for a political track, the Foreign Secretary is in the region today trying to advance precisely that.
Karen McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's been 7 days since the American president warned that Israel was in danger of losing global support because of its indiscriminate bombing in Gaza. That warning clearly hasn't been heeded, and I know what the Minister says about no impunity for war crimes, but that comes after the event. What signal will the UN be sending today to Israel to say that the line has clearly been crossed, we cannot support them, and that we do not condone what they have been doing in Gaza?
The Honourable Lady is right to make clear that there have been far too many civilian casualties in this fighting, and that a more surgical approach is required, and that is very much what the Prime Minister and the British government have called for. And we will continue to work towards a more sustainable cessation of hostilities and a sustainable ceasefire in the way that I have described.
Patrick Reddy.
The FCDO website advises people who might be travelling to Ukraine: if you travel to Ukraine to fight or to assist others engaged in the war, your activities may amount to offences under UK legislation and you could be prosecuted on your return to the UK. Why is there not a similar statement on the advice for travel to Israel?
Because, Mr. Speaker, the two situations are not analogous.
Richard Ford.
I'd like to quote from a newspaper column, an opinion column. Even if Israel manages to destroy Hamas, a similar movement will undoubtedly emerge from the destitution and despair of the Gaza Strip. That was written by the then Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg during Israel's Operation Protective Edge in August 2014. What is the British government doing to prevent the recurrence of this terrible violence that we are seeing in another decade?
Well, he is right, Mr. Speaker, to point to the fact that this is a dispute that has continued down the years, and he will also have noticed that it was after the crisis of the Yom Kippur War that progress was made politically, and then again after the First Intifada that progress was made. And what we must all hope for is that after this dreadful situation moves into a sustainable ceasefire, that the political track is once again able to grip these issues and ensure that a brighter future awaits an issue which has poisoned the well of international opinion in the Middle East and which deserves resolution, so that the children of those involved today can enjoy a better life than their parents have been able to.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Minister very much for his response to the questions, and also for the stance of the Minister and Government in relation to Hamas. Hamas are quite clearly a terrorist group. They're the baby killers, they're the rapists, they're the killers of innocent people, not just of Israelis, innocent Palestinians as well. That's who Hamas are, and they have to be destroyed. Can the Minister confirm on day 74 of Israel's response to the Hamas terrorist murders if he believes we have been able to exert any meaningful influence to bring about positive steps forward for the release of the hostages? Thank you.
Well, Mr. Speaker, in respect of the hostages, we are doing everything we possibly can to get them out, and he will understand, like the honourable gentleman, that I cannot give a running commentary across the House on that. In respect of his earlier comments, may I thank him both for his humanity and for his wisdom. Wish him a happy Christmas, and you, Mr. Speaker, and indeed the whole House.
That completes that urgent question. To the next urgent question.